Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second seminar dedicated to Mohale Mashigo's work. And as you all know, Mohale is our author in residence this year. And this year is our third edition of Ariel, which means Auteur en Résidence Internationale en Lorraine, a project which was initiated by Barbara Schmidt, Céline Sabiron, and Amy Pelletier. This year, we could welcome our author in residence thanks to our sponsors, Université de Lorraine, UT Charlemagne, UFR AEL Nancy, IDEA, and Métropole du Grand Nancy. Before I give the floor to Cédric Courtois, our chairperson today, to present this seminar, I'd like to thank my colleagues who have helped with the organization, Céline, Marilyn, Claire, Nathalie, Estelle, and our research assistants who have been working very hard to advertise these events. Lisa, Pauline, Delphine, Erast, and Elise, they're all master's degree students. This series of 5 seminars have been organized for our research lab, IDEA, and our master's degree students, and I hope there are many of you today here to follow this seminar. If you have questions or comments, do not hesitate to write them down under the YouTube video, and our guests today will be answering them or reacting to them. So I would like to thank our guests tonight, Kathie BIRAT and Richard SAMIN, who will be introduced by Lisa, my research assistant. And unfortunately, Richard could not be here with us today because of technical problems, but we found a solution and you'll be able to listen to him. And of course, you'll be able to read his paper later, as it will be published in our Ariel volume dedicated to Mohale. So now, Cédric, would you like to take over and present today's seminar? Thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or depending where you're situated right now, very good morning or evening to you. Well, I'm Cédric Courtois, Associate Professor at the University of Lille here in France, and I will be the chair of this panel today. I'm very honored to be here with you, and I do hope that you'll be enjoying this 1.5-hour session with us. Here is how we have planned things. There will be 2 30-minute papers, each of them followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. I deeply encourage all of you, whether you be students, academics, and or Mohale Mashigo's fans or others, to engage with what you will hear. I'd like to insist on the importance for students as well to really engage with what they will hear. And it's a great opportunity, of course, for them to ask for clarifications, for instance, or to react and simply give their opinions. Feel free to do so. Now, this particular session today is quite different from the one that took place a week ago. Last week, Véronique Tadjo talked about children's literature, both from South African and West African perspectives, while Julie Chancel gave a paper focusing on South African comics with reference to Mohale Mashigo's own experience as regards this particular genre. Talking about literary genres will partly be one of the main points today. Contrary to last week's speakers, today's speakers, Kathie BIRAT and Richard SAMIN, who will be introduced later by Lisa, decided to focus on Mashigo's fictional works. Kathie BIRAT will deal with Mashigo's 2018 short story collection, Intruders, while Richard SAMIN, who, as my colleague said, for technical reasons, can't be among us today, but he was kind enough to record his paper for us. Well, he will address Mashigo's first fictional work, a novel entitled The Yearning, written in 2016. Well, with no further ado, the first paper by Kathie BIRAT is entitled Through the Lens of Speculative Fiction, Seeing South Africa Through the Short Story Mohale Mashigo's Intruders. I'll let Lisa introduce Kathie, and once again, to all of you, do not hesitate to ask questions. I'll ask them at the end of Kathie's paper. Enjoy. Lisa?
Kathie BIRAT is an emeritus professor of English at the University of Lorraine. She has published numerous articles on American, African-American, and Afro-Caribbean writers, with particular emphasis, as far as the Caribbean is concerned, on the works of Carol Phillips, Fred Dargiar, Sam Selvin, and David Darbiden. She is especially interested in questions relating to voice and orality. She edited a special edition of Commonwealth Essays and Studies devoted to Carol Phillips in 2017. Among her recent publications are Making Sense of Memory in the Writings of the Caribbean Diaspora, Sam Selvon's London Calypso, which appeared in the Journal of Post-Colonial Writings in 2019, and Le point d'intrication, écriture, oralité, langue écrite et langue parlée dans la littérature de la Caraïbe anglophone, l'exemple de Sam Selvon, published in Pratique, Oralité, Literacy in 2020.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're just waiting for the slides. Mohale Mashigo's collection of short stories, Intruders, opens with an author's note introduced by a phonetic representation of the word intruders. This phonetic spelling suggests that the reader, if he is not to be seen as an intruder himself, must accept to pronounce the word as it appears on the page, and thus to relinquish that part of himself which might resist inclusion in a world in which words are not pronounced exactly as he is used to doing. The collection includes an author's note, a brief introduction in which the notion of speculative fiction is discussed, and 3 sections entitled The Good, the Bad, and the Colorful, each of which includes 4 stories. The collection ends with a remark by Ethel Barrymore. That's all there isn't any more, and a section of acknowledgments. Each section begins with a drawing, and here you can see the 3 drawings that begin the sections, each one of them representing a character from one of the stories. But I think the drawings are important because the stories definitely have a visual aspect. In order to be as concise as possible, while at the same time trying to capture the essence of what Mashigo is attempting to do in this collection of stories, I'm going to discuss the stories in their relation to Mashigo's use of the short story as a form and to the notion of speculative fiction. The underlying question in my reading of the stories is, what does the use of a speculative lens add to the imagining of a future that is free of white supremacy? Mohale Mashigo begins her introduction to the stories with Mark Derry's definition of Afrofuturism, which he describes as an African-American signification that appropriates images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future. You have 2 other definitions here of Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism is an art form, practice, and methodology that allows Black people to see themselves in the future despite a distressing past and present. This is a definition given by Greg Tate, who is a cultural critic. A number of different terms are used to designate forms of fiction that imagine alternative futures: speculative fiction, science fiction, dystopian, utopian fiction, fantasy, and there is some overlapping in all of these terms. The term speculative fiction is attributed to the science fiction writer Robert Heinlein, and the term has since come to be used to collectively describe works in the genres of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. One finds traces of these different aspects of speculative fiction in Intruders. Mashigo prefers the term speculative fiction to the notion of Afrofuturism, which she says is not for Africans living in Africa. She is concerned with imagining futures or reimagining a fantasy present, and the term speculative places the emphasis on imagination as a way of seeing. The use of the term speculative, from the Latin speculare, to see, suggests that speculation involves forms of sight, insight, hindsight, foresight, oversight, all of which can be found in Intruders. Before looking at the forms of speculation involved in Intruders, I think it is important to consider the role played by the short story, as I believe that it is the combination of a speculative point of view with the brevity of the form that gives a particular impact to these stories. The brevity of the short story contributes to its intensity and its impact on the reader. This aspect of the form has been much discussed since Edgar Allan Poe's well-known remarks about reading a story in one sitting. Some critics see in this combination of brevity and intensity a relationship with the lyric poem. In their introduction to the study of the short story, Liliane Louvel and Claudine Verlet talk about what they call the hybridity of the genre. Elizabeth Bowen stated that the short story should have the valid central emotion and inner spontaneity of the lyric. V.S. Pritchett considers that the short story begins as a poetic insight and is a way of seeing through a situation. One of the effects or the corollaries of this imagined proximity between the short story and the lyric is a perception of the ways in which the economy of the form produces a juxtaposition of the ordinary and the extraordinary, the mundane and the fantastic. This proximity, we will see, is at the heart of what Mohale Mashigo is doing with her stories in Intruders. One other important aspect of the hybridity of the short story is its relation to other forms of narrative, in particular the fairy tale and the folk tale. Mashigo refers to the importance of the folk tale and calls upon the form explicitly in the final story, Natisi. The fairy tale is also in the background through the use of motifs like that of the orphan or abandoned child and the reference to hidden or forbidden spaces, as in the story B&B in Bloom. If we return to the idea the short story involves a juxtaposition of the ordinary and the extraordinary, we can say that it is the speculative dimension that introduces elements of the extraordinary in Mashigo's representation of South Africa. Manuka is the story of a woman growing tentacles who kills her lover. When I realized that the tentacles came from beneath my kanga, I looked at Dumiso, foaming at the mouth and choking on blood. Only his eyes were moving. Ghost Strain N revolves around a young man who carries his friend Stephen, who has become a ghost, a living dead thing, around in a coffin in the backs of various stolen cars. Little Vultures suggests the idea of tampering with genetics. I quote, "We named baby A after the first man in creation." Hubris, I know. These fantastic or speculative elements are introduced into a narrative reality that constitutes the ordinary or mundane. Mashigo's purpose is to disturb what could be described as the normal relation between events and the explanation of them that could be given, without, however, venturing deeply into what could be called alternative realities. In speculative fiction, there are different levels of technicity, different degrees of engagement with the form. From this point of view, the brevity of the short story is crucial. In longer forms of fiction, the creation of alternative worlds either becomes an object in itself or tends toward political or cultural allegory. By keeping her stories short, Mashigo prefers their suggestive and hence speculative potential. To return to the remark made by V.S. Pritchett, the author's insight can be seen as the key to her use of foresight. What then exactly is the connection between the speculative and the ordinary in Intruders? The very motif of the intruder offers an important clue to this relation. The characters are seen as intruders in different ways. The inseparable girls in B&B in Bloom are orphans, as are the sisters Camo and Bonolo in Untitled 1, 2, and 3, and I quote, "Having been intruders for most of their lives, the girls knew instinctively which places adults didn't want them to enter. Nolwazi Botha, the woman who murdered her husband in On the Run, is also an adopted child. However, if the motif of the orphan gives a specific and literal meaning to the notion of intrusion, in a social sense, the idea underlies all of the stories, becoming a metaphor for the forms of exclusion involved. It constitutes a crucial link between the social background and the event which constitutes the narrative nucleus of each story. Ghost Strain N is concerned with South Africa's treatment of young drug addicts. B&B in Bloom with racism, violence against women, and the invisibility of the many abused people who built South Africa. On the Run evokes the violence against Blacks under apartheid. The High Heel Killer is concerned more specifically with violence against women. However, if the idea of the intruder can be seen as a way of focalizing and personifying the forms of exclusion that characterize life in South Africa, it is not simply an allegory of the ills affecting the country. There is no one-to-one relationship to be established between a character or an event and the social and political context of South Africa. Such an approach would simply shut down the stories rather than opening them up to the imagination, to the speculative. In order to understand how Mashigo uses the speculative lens to imagine futures, I'm going to look at two aspects of the stories that contributing to opening what I might call an imaginative window, offering a different or renewed perception of the world represented in the stories. The first aspect is human relationships, which play an essential role in bringing the social problems of South Africa into sharp focus. The second element is the relation between past and future. One element that seems constant in the stories is a focus on a relationship between two people, whether it be a relationship between a mother and daughter, grandmother and her granddaughter, between two sisters or twins, or between friends. The speculative elements bring this relationship into focus in ways that enlarge it, suggesting the possibility of human relations functioning as a counter space, a fortress against personalization that characterizes the surrounding society. A good example of this can be found in the three stories involving Camo and her sister Bonolo. The speculative setting of Untitled 1 is created by the anticipation of a cataclysmic event. The sun was definitely still in the sky, but angry clouds that looked like a frustrated artist's splashes of paint blocked it. People stood in the streets looking at the sky with curiosity, which grew into panic when it became apparent that the experts didn't have any answers. Bonolo's perception of the events in the story is guided by the reactions of her sister, who is described as mature for her years, although she is younger than Bonolo. By the end of the story, it becomes clear that Camo has decided that her sister should be the one to board a spaceship and leave the Earth. Against the background of the unbelievable events, the contrast between the different characters in the story stands out in bold relief. A few concise remarks suffice to reveal what is at stake in the relations between them. The contrast between the sisters, the strong-willed Camo and the doubting Bonolo, is expressed through their bodies. Bonolo closed her eyes and imagined she could still see Camo running back to the car, back straight, shoulders back, and neck resolute. She never looked back. This contrasts with the description of Bonolo being strapped into the spaceship. She felt she was floating as the blur in her egg-shaped compartment. Her arms, legs, and torso were strapped in. This functioning in counterpoint becomes clearer if one looks at another story, Ghost Strain N. In this story, the pivotal relationship concerns a young man named Koketso, who works in a funeral home, and his friend Stephen, who becomes one of the ghosts, the young people who have fallen into despair. You would think that the nation would have sat up when its young people lost their ability to stand up straight or speak. Nothing happened as these ghosts were overtaking corners of the townships. Saliva dripped from their mouths as their muscles relaxed, eyes half shut, some bent over in the kind of ecstasy and agony oblivion brings. Like Camo in Untitled 1, Koketso sets out to save his friend. Was Stephen far gone that some other group of frightened, angry people would see fit to kill him rather than let him eat the hearts of people? He didn't come to any satisfactory conclusion, but he knew what had to be done and packed a bag, filled it in a hurry with knives, a knobkerrie, his mother's church shawl, toilet paper, and other things he thought would be important, and all the canned food he could find. The reader's reaction to the crisis developing around the outbreak, scientists were calling it a virus, is channeled through the relationship between Koketso and Stephen, which serves as a lens through which the sensual and emotional life of the community becomes perceptible. The narrator says, in speaking of Koketso, how could he possibly describe anything when the world around him had lost its color? Stephen was the color ever since they were kids. Koketso drew the lines and saw the bigger picture, but Stephen always added the color and the purpose. This is where the poetic insight evoked by Pritchett becomes a vehicle for seeing through a situation. The situation in this case involves Koketso driving his friend around in a coffin in the backs of various stolen cars. As in Untitled 1, there is an apocalyptic atmosphere. Koketso was now on the run with his ghost friend. He was not ready to give up on Stephen. They avoided strangers, the army, and houses that could be seen from the road. The apocalyptic dimension of the narrative. Over time, houses were reverting back to nature. Those who once lived in them could never have imagined their homes covered by grass and vines. Pavements were 1/3 concrete and 2/3 what was being suppressed beneath it. This is balanced with an emphasis on Koketso's subjectivity, which keeps the story from being monopolized with horror. Another story entitled Little Vultures takes impersonal relations to a more abstract level and introduces as well the question of what it means to be human, which is a vital question in Mashigo's fiction. The speculation in this story involves tampering with the principle of life itself. The narrator says, "Before the animals, it was the babies. My research turned baby A into a reality. 2 females made a baby, and it was an abomination, according to those who were spokespeople for the gods. The relationship in this story involves 3 women. The narrator, who is a genomicist, Ingrid, a remarkable pianist with a strange desire to alter her face continually, and Violet, also a geneticist and one of the narrator's former classmates. In this case, the relationship between the women is conflictual. The question of tampering with nature serves as a mirror reflecting the forms of frustration experienced by the women. The farm they share becomes a microcosm of the problems faced by women: professional recognition, aging, motherhood. The story acquires dramatic intensity through the idea that the experimentation carried out by Violet involves crossing a line. The narrator possesses a capacity to hear people's thoughts that gives this notion of crossing a line a self-reflexive dimension. The story Little Vultures offers an occasion to consider the second aspect of Mashigo's imagining of the future, the question of hindsight. In other words, the relation between future and past. As in much African American fiction, and I think particularly of Toni Morrison's Beloved, there is a sense in these African stories that a failure to understand the past will compromise the future. Tampering with the future is a way of reimagining the past. In Little Vultures, the narrator's experimentation with the quagga, an extinct subspecies of the zero, offers insight on South Africa's past. The narrator says, "I guess you could say my work is conservation of extinct animals." The fate of the quagga, which became extinct in 1878, is linked to the history of South Africa. It was hunted by early Dutch settlers and later by Afrikaners. It competed with domesticated animals for forage after the Dutch settlement of the region. Thus, in an oblique way, the narrator's experimentation with the quagga evokes questions of rivalry, territory, and exclusion in relation to human populations in South Africa. The idea of genetic tampering also suggests darker ideas of race and eugenics. The death threats received by the narrator reactualize these questions in the present of the narration. The short story itself becomes the site of an experimentation involving the reimagining of the past in terms of an alternative future. One could say that the intrusion of the future in these stories is a response to certain forms of exclusion that characterized the past. Exclusion, inclusion, intrusion, these ideas are closely related. Mashigo's stories reactivate the past by representing a character's confrontation with a situation of crisis. The past is therefore not simply a static representation consigned to individual or collective memory. It is reactivated in a narrative confrontation with the necessity of imagining the future. The story Untitled 2, which picks up the story of Bonolo being sent into space by her sister Camo, presents the future in terms that reflect the standard cliches of science fiction involving space travel and the search for new planets. What interests Mashigo is not the technology of space travel, but the fundamental questions that underline our imagining of space travel as a response to the disasters provoked on Earth. In Untitled 1, an unidentified voice had said, "We are used to disasters here in South Africa, just look at our government." As she is floating through space, in Untitled 2, Bonolo thinks to herself, maybe when I am out there, I will find a different set of people with a sense of history and irony, because this place is suffocating me. That Mashigo would associate the words irony and history is significant in itself. For anyone with a real sense of history will be sensitive to the ironies that underlie all history. What she presents in her stories is not a collection of facts that could be called history, but a series of situations which, if properly understood, can be seen as condensations of history, as metaphors for the monsters spawned by the history of South Africa. The end of the story raises the vital question of the possibility of a future, of what one will find on a new planet. When Bonolo leaves the spaceship, she says, "I fell on my knees, still keeping my hands in the air. How is this possible? Standing around me, all with their hands up, is me. Not really me, but there are 6 people or things standing around with the same face as me. They are different heights and sizes, but all wearing the same me mask. I drop my hands to my sides, and they drop theirs as well. Oh God." There are several possible interpretations of this outcome. It could suggest, and this is a staple of speculative fiction, that travel to outer space will only reveal the repetition of what already exists, that Bonolo will be confronted with a mirror image of herself. It could also imply, and this is in keeping with patterns found in other stories, that a transformation is possible, offering new possibilities within the same basic framework of identity. Ultimately, what is at stake in Mashigo's use of speculative fiction is the very possibility of seeing or imagining a future for Africans. Foresight, if it is not guided by insight and hindsight, may imply a desire for control, the temptation to colonize the future as a replica of the past. In an article entitled Post-Colonial Futures, Climate, Race, and the Yet to Come, Andrew Baldwin summarizes the dilemma facing post-colonial approaches to the challenges of the future. The yet to come can be promissory. It is precisely recognition of an open, malleable future that fuels the ethics and politics of invention now so prevalent across the social sciences and humanities. But more often than not, and this is Derrida's point, the yet to come is monstrous, excessive, and unknowable. And he goes on to say, I wish to suggest that a revitalized post-colonial theory would do well to address itself to the ways in which the yet to come is itself colonized, but also to the ways in which the subaltern becomes central to its colonization. Mashigo's stories speculate about the conditions necessary for imagining the future. The wings that the narrator grows in The High-Heel Killer can be seen as the concrete form of her newly acquired capacity to act in her own defense. As she says at the end of the story, I birthed myself. It was bloody and painful, but I'm standing on the roof of a city as something new. Up here, nobody can tell me what I deserve, who I should be, or how I should be. And I dare those down below to open their mouths and tell another tired, underpaid woman that she deserves the cruelty of the city. I'm the enemy of cruelty, and they'll have to deal with me.
Well, thank you very much, Kathie, for this very thought-provoking paper addressing the issues of genre, particularly the short story, of course, here, and speculative fiction. I do want to, because I can't see any question for the moment from our YouTube viewers, but I have a question to bounce back on one of your last ideas about post-colonialism and this particular aspect. I'm particularly interested in the first text in Intruders, which I would consider myself, you'll tell me whether you agree with me or not, this text entitled Afrofuturism, Ayashi Zamateki, which I would consider as some sort of a literary manifesto in order to better understand maybe what comes next. And in this particular text, she says, Mashigo explains, I quote, "I'm also interested in who we are now, no matter how unremarkable we seem, under the lens of speculative fiction." This is partly part of your title. And her focus here seems to be on seemingly unremarkable people. And later in the same essay, she also explains that as a Black person in South Africa, she has never really suffered from a lack of representation, be it on TV or others, but she still admits that in South Africa, her, I quote, culture, language and presence were considered a nuisance. And from that perspective, how post-colonial or maybe decolonial do you think her collection of short story could be considered? Do you think that decoloniality could have something to do with this collection of short stories?
Right. Well, she's definitely concerned with the visibility or invisibility of people that she says, we were simply considered to be a nuisance. So I think she says something interesting in the story Ghost Train N. There's a remark that I like a lot. At the beginning of the story, the narrator says, "You see, a major event is really just a string of small, overlooked events holding hands." So the whole idea of what is visible, what is perceptible, and the perspective from which you see this. And she is looking at South Africans from the perspective of someone living in South Africa. So for her, because we talked together in an interview about Afrofuturism, and of course, Afrofuturism, she specifically says that she doesn't really see herself in terms of Afrofuturism, because Afrofuturism is the film Black Panther. So, where do you really see Africans in that? So her idea of speculative fiction is basically seeing what there is to see in South Africa and seeing what is remarkable about things that seem unremarkable, like boys surfing on trains, something that she refers to also in Ghost Train N. So I think this is why the emphasis on human relationships is important also, because it's basically a question of the perspective from which you're looking at things and what it is that makes people remarkable or unremarkable.
Okay, so I have a question from one of our viewers. How do you articulate speculative fiction, Afrofuturism, and magical realism?
Well, Afrofuturism, if you look at the definition of it that Derry gives, he is going to insist. Wait a minute, if I find this again, he's going to insist on the idea of technology. For instance, in the interview, there's a long interview that she took this remark about speculative fiction from this essay called Black to the Future, which is, of course, a joke, Back to the Future. This is an interview with Sam Delaney, Greg Tate, and Tricia Rose, in which they talk a lot about the question of technology. I think that Afrofuturism tends to emphasize this sort of technical vision of the future. Now, as far as speculative fiction is concerned, I think speculative fiction is perhaps the broadest term that is used. It's a term that can be used for any kind of fiction that is concerned with trying to see, to imagine the future. And as I mentioned, it's like apparently Robert Heinlein, the American science fiction writer, who was the source of this particular term, speculative fiction. But now, as far as magic realism is concerned, this is something that maybe we should also ask Mohale Mashigo about. I don't really feel that she's concerned here with magic realism. Magic, of course, there's the whole problem of how you categorize fiction. When you think of magic realism, you think of Alejo Carpentier, or you think of Ben Okri in Africa. It seems to me that she's not really using this kind of idea of two levels of reality, one of which can be seen as magic and the other real, nor is she trying to use a purely psychological perspective. But I think the interest really of speculative fiction for her is doing something that in a way sort of jolts you or shocks you. But I don't think if you add the magical realism aspect, then you sort of put it back into a traditional African context, which is present in Mashigo's fiction, particularly in terms of storytelling. But I don't think that she's really concerned with magic realism here. She's because basically when I talk about, or she talks about, seeing things through the lens of speculative fiction, she's using, in a sense, the cliches of science fiction and speculative fiction, but not taking them very far. Because as I said at the beginning of my paper, when you go too far into speculation, it tends to become allegory or ideology. And I think this is really not what she's interested in. She's interested in opening up perspectives.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. You mentioned the division of the collection into 3 sections, the good, the bad, the colorful. Is there a thematic or other unity in each section which justifies this division? And is there some form of evolution throughout the collection which justifies the order in which the short stories appear? Do you need me to repeat, or no? No, is that okay? Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I wondered about the good, the bad. I think particularly the section that is titled The Bad, you have, for instance, the high heel killer. In other words, the woman who kills someone who has been harassing her. And this picture, the picture at the beginning of the section called The Bad, I think this picture refers to a story that I did not discuss specifically, a story on the run called On the Run, in which a woman kills her husband in a very violent way. And this is the woman, I think, who kills her husband. You recognize her by the way she describes her hair. So the section called The Bad, you have several women who do violent things and could be seen as the bad from a social point of view. In the section called The Colorful, you have the high heel killer who is going to transform. This is the colored picture that you have on the cover of the collection, and who I think through her gesture of fighting back and killing someone with a high heel, which is rather humorous in a way, and there is a certain amount of humor in these stories, is going to reach a kind of affirmation which perhaps gives her more color. Now, as to whether there is a progression what about the arrangement of the stories in the collection? I haven't really given that any thought specifically. I didn't really see any particular progression, except, of course, in the stories Untitled 1, 2, and 3 that involve the same characters. Perhaps what is significant also is the fact that the final story, Natisi, and I may not be pronouncing that right, but in this story, there is a return to the notion of storytelling in the sense of the folktale. So the fact that this is the final story might be significant, since it perhaps goes back to the importance of oral storytelling, because, as I also mentioned, there is a distinct connection between the short story as a form and orality. This is something that is very obvious, particularly in American fiction, in the American short story. And so I think the fact that she puts this story at the end, I think this is a statement also about the connection between storytelling and the folktale. And she has insisted on this, I think, quite a lot.
Okay, thank you, Kathie. There's another question. Considering your emphasis on sight and on the visual, would you describe Mashigo's writing in Intruders as cinematic? And a question which is, well, just from the same viewer, more generally, any thought about possible intermedial influences, for example, the use of the zombie figures, for example?
Yes, because she's using things that she picks up from various types of media. And this, I think, is, if I remember correctly, is something she talked about in our conversation, because she's talking about South Africa not as a place that is isolated from the world, but that is a place like all countries in the world today that is connected to everything. So you have references to B movies, to C movies. You have references to music. Although I admit I was thinking Miriam Makeba, but no, that's Miriam Makeba appears in the Yearning. But there are references to sending text messages, to songs, to movies. So there is this sense that precisely we're not in a world of folklore of the past. We're in a South Africa that is connected in many different ways to the outside world. Plus the fact that, as I said, she's using a certain number of things like spaceships that are really almost cliches, but also the zombies, the werewolves, a number of elements that are basically cliches of comic strips and films.
Okay, thank you so much, Kathie, for this wonderful paper, and thank you everyone for the great questions that you asked. Well, now, as I said at the beginning, the next speaker is Richard SAMIN, who, for technical reasons, as I said before, can't be with us today. He nevertheless recorded his paper entitled Mohale Mashigo's The Yearning, Vindicating African Storytelling in Post-Transitional South Africa. However, before we listen to Richard, I suggest I briefly explain what the Yearning is about by giving you some details concerning the diegesis. I'm going to share a PowerPoint document with you, and I do hope that this will be useful as an anticipation to Richard's paper. So I'm waiting maybe for the document to appear on the screen. Yes, it's coming. So the Yearning was published in 2016, and it's a novel that is composed of 5 parts. The first and the last ones being very short. The 5 parts are the Yearning, the Name, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and Amen. It's a first-person narrative. The protagonist is Marubini, a middle-class young woman who works at the De Villiers wine farm, particularly in the marketing department. Before she decided to resign from her former job in advertising, because she had come to hate that job, she explains, most of my colleagues thought that taking a 2-hour township tour that ended at a tourist-friendly drinking spot was a good way to get to know the target market, she explains. She adds that, it's another quote that you have on the document, they just couldn't get why I would object to the fact that Black people were portrayed dancing. Why would they be dancing when the advert was for tea? There are traces of racism in that company that she can't put up with, hence her decision to leave that very company. Her story is intrinsically linked to the greater story of racism in the country. Marubini's boyfriend is a restaurant owner and a Frenchman, while Unati is her best friend. So maybe there's a family tree at some point, maybe, yes, it's on the screen right now, for you to identify the relationships between the different characters. Storytelling, which appears in Richard Samin's title, is at the very heart of this novel. And it's very important for Mohale Mashigo herself, who in an interview said, I quote, that's the next slide, we bury our stories and wonder why we are so much in pain. So these ideas of burial and memory are central in this novel, and just in passing, I will dwell on this next week when I give my paper. Also worthy of interest at the beginning of the novel is the emphasis that is laid on the community of women, the grandmother, the mother, Unati, but also the protagonist herself. There's also an emphasis on circularity. The novel starts with a birth and ends with a birth, for example. One element that could be interesting for the reader, but also for you in general, is also the lack of linearity in the novel itself and the use of the stream of consciousness technique. Now, let's listen to Richard. And again, it would be great if you could comment this time on what you hear, rather than ask questions, as Richard is not among us today. Please note that you will listen to a shortened version of his paper. It was supposed to contain 3 parts, but because we don't have enough time, we'll listen to 2 of them only. We're very sorry about that. Now let Lisa introduce Richard Samin.
Richard Samin taught at the University of Lorraine from 1998 to 2009, first as an assistant professor until 2001, and then as a professor. Since 2009, he has been an emeritus professor. Formerly, he worked in primary and secondary education, and he taught French and English in Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Côte d'Ivoire for 16 years. He wrote a doctorate thesis on 2 South African writers' novels, Alex Laguma and Eskia Mphalele, which he defended at the University of Rouen in June 1986. His field of study focuses on South African literature and history, post-colonial studies, and literary theory. He carried out several research missions in South Africa in 1995, 1997, 1999, and 2002, which were funded by the French Institute of South Africa, IFAS, in Johannesburg. In the course of these missions, he had the opportunity to meet and interview many South African authors and cultural actors. His works focus on several South African writers such as J.M. Coetzee, Alex Laguma, Eskia Mphalele, and Ivan Vladislavic, and on various themes: city, landscape, colonial space, and interdisciplinary. His works and many of his interviews were published in journals and collective works in France as well as in Germany, South Africa, the United States, Japan, and Switzerland.
In an article on post-transitional South African literature in English, Ronit Frankel and Craig Mackenzie contend that the fiction written during that period is characterized by, I quote, a proliferation of genres, concerns, and styles, and includes such features as politically incorrect humor, incisive satire, and the mixing of genres with zest and freedom, end of quote. South African sociologist Sarah Nuttall further identifies the cultural production of the period as, quote, blendings, interconnections, hybridities, and ambiguities, end of quote. Mohale Mashigo's The Yearning displays some of these features, but is also a narrative that offers a personal take on today's South Africa. This is a period which, according to Sarah Nuttall, is no longer dominated by the segregated theory which under apartheid underpinned an oppositional logic of master dualisms such as perpetrators and victims, oppression and resistance, black and white. As a result, it is a period fraught with uncertainties and contradictions, where many are at a loss to find their own bearings. In this context, I contend that The Yearning hinges around two interrelated themes, a quest for truth and a process of self-empowerment. The question is how the narrative structure serves a longing for meaning in personal identity, and how its national and even transnational imaginary space dovetails with the problematic question of cultural identity in a multicultural country. My paper will be divided into three parts. First, The Yearning as a search for truth and identity. Second, The Yearning as a tale of empowerment. And third, The Yearning's contribution to cultural syncretism. In her introductory chapter, Mohale Mashigo underlines the importance of storytelling and asserts that, quote, stories matter, and so do the voices of storytellers, especially stories by young South African writers. But above all, she strongly vindicates her belonging to the field of literature. The Yearning is my small contribution towards putting us in literature, because we do belong. A vindication which she reiterates 2 years later in her introduction to a collection of short stories, Intruders, when she asserts that what I want for Africans living in Africa is to imagine a future in their storytelling that deals with issues that are unique to us. In both texts, Mohale Mashigo clearly puts forward the issues she wants to engage with. In post-transitional South Africa, victims and oppressors share the same living space. It is a new configuration that Achille Mbembe describes as one of illicit cohabitation between oppressors and oppressed, with the result that post-colonial identities are coeval rather than incommensurate. Paul Gilroy used the notion of conviviality to refer to the process of cohabitation and interaction that has made multiculture an ordinary feature of social life. Mohale Mashigo describes her situation in terms which more or less echo both Mbembe's and Gilroy's ideas, when she asserts that she never suffered from a lack of representation, but at the same time, she said that she was living in a country where my culture, language, and presence were considered a nuisance. The Yearning maps out the concrete and singular conditions conducive to the heroine's discovery of the truth and of the nature of her desire or yearning. As regards the concept of desire, Gilles Deleuze claims that it is not a hankering for something that is wanting, but an energy, a power to persist and invent one's own style so as to go as far as one can to eschew being assigned to a single identity. A notion that the heroine seems to endorse at the beginning of The Yearning. Quote, the part of who I used to be has vanished, and I'm now faced with the possibilities of who I could be, end of quote. The Yearning is a tale that skillfully combines different cultural motifs and social backgrounds. Its structure is composed of two temporal levels. One constitutes a framing narrative located in the present, onto which is grafted an embedded narrative located in the past. While the framing narrative is written in the present tense and follows a chronological order, with a few analeptic sections in which the heroine remembers episodes of her past, the embedded narrative, on the other hand, is written in the past tense and does not follow a chronological line. It is basically an analeptic text that moves back and forth in time in order to piece together episodes of the heroine's past in the manner of a jigsaw puzzle. It is up to the reader to replace the events in the appropriate order. Each narrative level is divided into fragments that regularly alternate as they shift from one temporal level to another. Each transition from the present to the past is carefully engineered with words or themes that help the reader tie together the narrative threads into an elaborate pattern. Moreover, in order to establish a more visible distinction between the two levels, the author uses different fonts. The centripetal force that holds the whole structure together is the overwhelming presence of the heroine's voice and consciousness on both temporal levels, in the form of an intra-homodiegetic narrator. It allows the reader to be closely in touch with all the external factors that affect her and with the responses to them. Our narrative also encompasses a plurality of other voices and stories that give the novel its dialogical dimension. To sum up the story, Marubeni is a modern, dynamic, hardworking and willful middle-class young woman who has a job in the marketing department of a Stellenbosch wine farm after quitting an advertising agency in reaction to white residual racial attitudes. She lives in Cape Town and shares her life with her French lover, Pierre, a restaurant owner, and her friend, Unati. The plot is triggered with an enigmatic statement uttered by her maternal grandmother, Nkono, about her name, and by an allusion to lies. I quote, "Nkono says she regrets giving me my name. Mom, I don't think my name is the problem. The real problem is all the lies." End of quote. Soon after, she suffers from mysterious bodily ailments and mental confusion that baffle her understanding. She has seizures, hallucinations, nightmares. She feels nauseous and fears that her flat is haunted. The iteration and increasing severity of these phenomena occasionally bring about loss of consciousness and hospitalization. As a result, she's determined to find out the causes of these incapacitating disorders. A quest for truth commands the drift of the story. The novel displays a fairly wide range of generic affiliations. It can be read, first of all, as a life story relating Marubeni's life from the day of her birth to the present. Second, it is at the same time a Bildung story that retraces the different episodes of her education into adulthood. Third, it is a psychological thriller that invites a rational inquiry into the heroine's mysterious somatic and psychological disorders. Four, it is a narrative that carries us beyond the realm of reality with its elements of fantasy and magical realism. The sudden intrusion of unnatural phenomena such as oral and visual hallucinations, shadowy presences, tactile sensations on our body, often accompanied by physiological reactions such as nausea, dizziness, seizures, bouts of crying and screaming, create a kind of Unheimlichkeit or uncanniness. The uncertainty which the character experiences is also the uncertainty the reader may possibly have to make sense of them. Uncertainty or hesitation is precisely the key criterion which Svetlana Todorov uses to define fantasy. I quote, "Fantasy is the uncertainty which a person whose cognitive mental setup entirely relies on natural laws experiences when he is confronted with an event that seems unnatural." End of quote. The eeriness that kind of fantasy entails relates essentially to the framing narrative, that is, to the heroine's present. The other unnatural phenomena which are reported in what I have called the embedded narrative do not exactly come under fantasy, but under another generic category, that of magical realism. In this typology of magical realism, William Spindler makes out two kinds of magical realism. One is anthropological realism, which gives popular culture and magical beliefs the same degree of importance as Western science and rationality. The other is ontological magic realism, in which the supernatural is presented in a matter-of-fact way, as if it did not contradict reason, and no explanations are offered for the unreal events in the text. The Yearning displays a combination of both magical realisms, and it is the implicit acceptance of this form of magical realism which validates the truth value of such statements as "My mother died 7 times before she gave birth to me," or "My father was a snake, a water snake." And more significantly, the ancestors communicated their wishes through my body. In other words, the notion of magical realism used here is simply the generic expression of beliefs and practices whose validity is upheld by a specific cultural context. The articulation between fantasy and magical realism allows the introduction of cultural difference and foregrounds the relationship between the past and the present. Towards the end of the novel, one of the heroine's grandmothers muses about her granddaughter's problems. Quote, "Who is to say whether it is trauma or the calling?" Unquote. Such a question begs two possible answers. One falls within the province of the somatic and psychological, the trauma, and the other falls within the province of the religious or the magic, the calling. As a reminder, Marubini's father left his family to follow the calling, just as his aunt got the calling which changed her life. In other words, both went through rites of initiation to become some sangomas or traditional healers. The end of the novel, of course, brings an answer to both questions. Some of Marubini's ailments can be first ascribed to the trauma she suffered as a child after being sexually molested by an adult, but also to the fact that, as her mother belatedly discovers, she is pregnant. The other symptoms are directly related to a connection with African spirituality and history, which, in her case, is not simply a religious calling, but a yearning. That is, a desire that envelopes both a religious and a secular commitment. The multi-layered generic inscriptions in the novel reflect the epistemological uncertainty that is in keeping with the main character's restless quest for empowerment. The Yearning is a life story of empowerment which relates how, through a series of happy or harrowing experiences, a girl grows up into a young woman who finally comes into her role as a lover, mother, and sangoma. There are two ways of interpreting the heroine's evolution until she discovers the truth behind her predicament. First, a narration can be envisioned as a discursive exercise akin to a psychoanalytical procedure whereby the patient is gradually led to discover the source of her psychological disorders by inducing her to describe the symptoms that perturb her. It is most often a protracted and episodic affair that requires the presence of an analyst. The fragmentic structure of the novel and the role played by some of the protagonists as privileged interlocutors may warrant such a reading. The second way of reading the story of Marubini's life is to focus on the nature of her sensations, or more precisely, on how she describes the external factors which affect her body and her sensibility, and how she reacts to them. In this respect, the body plays an essential part in several ways. First, it is the seat of somatic and psychological affections. Second, her body is instrumental in the way she accedes to agency and self-fulfillment. Third, the body as a cultural marker is inserted in a web of practices pertaining to African beliefs and spirituality. The eponymous introductory chapter ends with a series of anaphoras in which the word yearning is the subject of verbs that are all related to bodily affections. The yearning haunts him, the yearning confuses her, the yearning hurts me, the yearning devours us. These iterations, which endow a single word with agency, invite the reader to turn to the dictionary. It only tells us that to yearn is to be filled with longing, compassion, or tenderness for something or towards a person. If we accept Ludwig Wittgenstein's assertion that the signification of a word lies in its usage in the language, the introductory chapter boils down to an invitation to pay particular heed to the context of its occurrences. There is one theme which I would like to focus on. One night, Marubini finds herself alone in her boss's office. She is overwhelmed by a feeling that it is not fear, but, I quote, a yearning, a longing to be outside, end of quote. Then she hears a voice that tells her to walk towards the lake. And suddenly she realizes that she's running without her feet touching the soil, and that her body's voice guides her. She then finds herself naked, with half of her body immersed in water. The water is cool, but she heats it up with a longing, to the extent that steam rises from the water and hangs like a curtain, shielding her. As she further sinks into the water, she's without doubt fear or confusion, and she notes that the body voice speaks and tells her to trust herself for the truth. The whole scene obviously posits a connection between yearning, body, and truth, suggesting that her yearning is a quest for truth in which the body plays a major role. Later in the novel, her father's aunt, whom she calls grandmother, Magogo, grandmother in isiZulu, confirms that this connection between yearning and truth. Marubini's yearning is a yearning for the truth that we took away from her. The accumulation of bodily disorders which undermine both her sanity and sense of identity eventually goad her into finding out what is wrong with her. I really have no idea what's going on, but something is, and I can't live without finding out what. As a result, she accepts to submit herself to a ritual during which certain rites are performed on her body so that she might retrieve episodes of her past. I quote, "There is smoke filling the room. I can't see it, but I can feel it. It slips into my nostrils and from there into my entire body." End of quote. This brings me to the second way in which the body is instrumental in our discovery of the truth and our accession to empowerment. In order to deal with this point, I need to refer briefly to a few philosophical concepts, such as affections and affects as defined by Spinoza. Briefly speaking, affections are modifications of our body brought about by the encounter with external bodies or objects. Affects, on the other hand, are affections that modify our power of existing and of acting. Spinoza makes out two types of affects. Affects of joy that include pleasure, love, happiness, and leisure. Affects of sadness that include suffering, pain, hatred. While affects of joy increase our power of acting, affects of sadness diminish it. The encounter with external bodies or objects, depending on how they combine with our body, can thus either make it stronger or weaken it. If we choose to consider Marubini's evolution in this light, we realize that she keeps wavering between contrasting moods depending on the degree with which her affections impinge on her understanding. The trauma she underwent in her childhood and the noxious affections that ensued were translated into a protracted diminution of her power of acting. Conversely, whenever her experiences or perceptions generate more congenial affections, she feels at one with her body and her power of acting is increased. This is the case, for instance, when she finds herself immersed in the lake, as we have seen above, or when she remembers all the happy moments she shared with her grandfather, Mpate Moholo, or with her grandmother, Nkono, during an initiation into womanhood. We could add to this list love-making, as was the case with her first boyfriend. I quote, "The more I had sex, the more I enjoyed it. We even learned new things together. I was never scared to learn. I would insist that we do new things together, sometimes to Tabo's dismay." End of quote. The most significant effects of joy that increase her power of acting are related to the moments when she finally discovers the true causes of her ailments and of her father's absence. But the body does not simply facilitate the heroine's empowerment. It is also a signifier that occupies a prominent part in African spirituality, insofar as it is associated with various rites of initiation or purification. In order to heal her daughter, Marubini's father, in keeping with the belief that, I quote, "every healer knows that memories are located in the body," unquote, and that it is the blood that keeps them in the body, her father makes a few incisions on her wrist and her neck to collect a little of her blood so that the darkness it contains might be drained from her body and carried away. His mission, as he explained, is to carry the burden of the pain she has suffered to a faraway place where, quote, "we, Abantu, were once kings, queens, and wise scholars of the stars and moons," unquote. This is a place of origins where the strongest ancestors live, and they alone can deliver him of his burden. In other words, with a father's odyssey, Mohale Mashigo gestures towards the myth of an age-old tradition, which Marubini herself embodies, given the meaning of her name, ancient civilization, and the descriptions her grandmother gives of her when she was born. "You look like a queen from an ancient civilization, so regal and certain. You look so much like a tiny queen from a long time ago." Marubini occupies a legitimate place in this age-old tradition as she carries on the legacy of her father. Like him, she wears a bangle of red and white beads, white and red being also the colors of the snake into which her father changes in the last vision she has of him. Incidentally, the snake in some African societies, as John Beatty notes in his book, African Religion and Philosophy, is the form that the spirits take to visit the living. Moreover, within the field of Black South African literary culture, the allusion to a water snake recalls the scene depicted by Thomas Buffalo in his novel Shaka, when Shaka, bathing naked in a pool, encounters the king of the deep pool, that is, a huge water snake, which embraces him and predicts his future. I quote, a small column of thick mist arose from the deep pool. It formed an elongated cloud which came and covered him so that he could see nothing. And then out of the reeds over there, something boomed with a heavy, stentorious voice. Kalamajweng, Kalamajweng, it is seen only by the favored ones. Kalamajweng is seen by those who will rule over nations. End of quote. The idea of timelessness that envelopes Malubili may apparently contradict her willingness to enjoy the present to the utmost, as she does, for instance, after making love with her lover. I quote, "I close my eyes, drenched in now," end of quote. Or her father's advice, "Always choose today." But such a stance does not preclude the idea of eternity as defined by Wittgenstein. Quote, "If one conceives of eternity not as an infinite temporal duration, but as timelessness, so he lives eternally who lives in the present." End of quote. The layering of different cultural and literary traditions that the Yearning encapsulates is an exercise which has characterized the development of Black South African literature throughout its history. Conclusion. The Yearning is a quest for identity, vindicating an African heritage through a process of transculturation, whereby African law, particularly African spirituality, is reprocessed through Western narrative procedures that inscribe African culture in literature on a national and global scene. The Yearning is a tale that wavers between rationality and fantasy, a cognitive wavering that illustrates the cultural syncretism whereby two main cultural realms, European and African, come to meet on unequal terms. The form of storytelling that the Yearning vindicates is, as the author claims in her introduction to Intruders, valid, because it is essential in a country that has for many years let stories get buried in unmarked graves. This statement comes as an echo of a similar statement which Esclarmonde made a few decades earlier to vindicate traditional storytelling, which provided him with, quote, "a good training ground from which to launch an odyssey of the imagination and inform the morality associated with African humanism. A simple faith, free of the tyranny of theology and intellectual argument." End of quote. The Yearning perpetuates this ongoing pursuit of both spiritual and artistic freedom. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Richard. Unfortunately, he's not with us today. I don't know if there are comments on coming from YouTube. Maybe I have a question for Kathie. Kathie, I can't see you, but I'd love to see you. Maybe to link your presentation and Richard's presentation. You mentioned hybridity in your paper. Richard refers to cultural syncretism or transculturalism. Do you have the impression that this hybridity is Mohale Mashigo staple? And I read in an interview recently that as a member of what she calls the integration generation, she and other members of her generation, I quote, unconsciously code switch both linguistically and culturally. Maybe a question concerning this concept of code switching and particularly code switching culturally in her work. Would you say something about this? Or
yes, I think there's a lot of code switching, and I think she's trying to find original ways to do this. And in this novel, having both the South African present, in which The character is working for a winery. So the present seems, in a sense, almost not really anchored in South Africa. It could almost be anywhere. And on the other hand, the complexities of the ways in which people are reaching into the past. And I think that she also shows very diverse characters. For instance, the mother who is going to open a nursery and therefore become independent. The aunt, Thoko, who has the calling and is a Sangoma, as her father was. So you have also a kind of hybridity of roles. The grandfather who really spends a lot of time with his granddaughter. So I think there's definitely a sense, once again, as there is in the short stories, of South Africa in the world, something that maybe makes it a little bit more difficult precisely for the character to get back in touch with her past. And you talked about code switching. Of course, code switching is a term that is used in talking about language. The mixing of languages is fascinating. And, well, Mohale Mashigo talked about that in her first presentation in Nancy, because I asked her a question about the languages. And she said, like most writers, she said, I always give you some way of understanding what the Zulu or the Sesotho is really saying, so that you're not left there wondering, you know, the characters are talking among themselves and I can't understand what they're saying. But I thought that the use of the African languages was very interesting, because the characters quite obviously tend to use them in situations of intimacy among themselves. So, and there's a very interesting moment when I think it is her mother, Maru's mother, who talks about the Sangoma and uses the word witchcraft. And I thought that that was interesting because she uses the English word. And then, of course, it raised the question in my mind, what language are these people speaking? Because the novel is written in English. But the fact that she uses this English term, which gives a kind of derogatory connotation, whereas the word Sangoma is specifically African. So there's definitely this sense of two worlds that are trying to somehow live together.
Okay, there's a YouTube comment also. Richard SAMIN emphasized the dialogical dimension of the yearning. Do you also identify, Kathie, sorry, you're very solicited today, identify a dialogical dimension in the Intruders?
Well, yes, because there's all of the interaction between the characters. That Richard didn't talk necessarily very much about in his paper, but you can't talk about everything. But that's what I find interesting. You have the mother, the father. You have Makusha, who is the mother, the father, Baba. You have Maru. You have her brother, Simpue. You have the grandmother, the aunt. You have all of these people who do not necessarily represent the same ideas or the same positions. And so there's also Maru's, in a sense, growing up or coming to terms with herself, is going to bring all of these people back into conversation with each other. That's why I found, for instance, the fact that her mother has a nursery, the mother seems to be quite modern. Thoko, the aunt, represents a more traditional position in being a Sangoma. So a lot of the interest of the story, I think, comes from the interactions between these different characters. Plus, you have the boyfriend who is French, Franco-Moroccan. So the dialogical aspect is important because it's really what makes the story advance. As in any novel, if you can't deal with dialogue, then you can't write a novel. And this novel is very good from that point of view.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kathie. Well, thank you to the organizers. Thank you to our speakers, Kathie and Richard. Of course, he wasn't here today, but thank you very much. But above all, maybe thank you to the audience. I hope you did make the most of this session, and we also do hope that you will be among us next week, same place, same time. And do not hesitate, of course, to tell people around you to come and join us. Meanwhile, take good care of yourselves. Goodbye.